let's build this animation in Nordcraft. One of my absolute favorite things we've shipped in Nordcraft recently is the new animation editor. I think it's a complete game changer. So if you've been around for a while like me, you might remember Flash. Now Flash had a lot of problems, especially around performance, but one thing that was fantastic was the Macromedia Flash editor. Because you had this whole keyframe view and you could animate things and you could build like these tween animations. It was incredible. And it spawned so much creativity. And with HTML5 and CSS3, we got keyframe animations now built into CSS, which was way more performance from a technological perspective, way superior. But we didn't have the editor. And that meant that, I think at least that meant a lot of the creativity kind of died down. People weren't as adventurous when building website anymore. And that's changed a little bit in recent years, but I still think that with the right tooling, you really get to just pay more attention to the details. So I want to show you what we've done in Nordcraft to try and bring that back. So I'm here in a completely clean project. I've got a single main. The only thing I have here is an overflow hidden on it. But other than that, it's a completely clean setup. And I want to go and create a bouncing ball effect where we have a ball that sort of lands and bounces on a table, right? So let's start by building up that scene. And when we've done that, then we can look at adding animation, right? So I'm going to add a div, right? This is going to be my table. I'm going to say it's going to have a width of 100% and height of 150 pixels. Then it's going to have a background, and the background is actually going to be a gradient going from, I don't think we're going to go from exactly white. Maybe we are, actually. Let's start it down just a little bit. So we get this sort of nice table gradient. And the last thing I want to do is I want to tilt it backwards so it looks like it's sort of going into the scene. We get a little bit of a 3D effect, right? And to do that, I'm going to go and add a transform here. And I'm going to go with rotate. And since I'm rotating it like away from me, that's going to be the x-axis. X-axis is the horizontal axis. I'm picking this one. And then we'll just start rotating. And I think this is pretty good. But it's kind of hard to see because normally when you do 3D rotation in CSS, it's kind of flat, but we can fix that with perspective. So on the parent element here, I'm going to add another transform, and we're going to say perspective, and I'm going to say distance is 800 pixels. And immediately you can see we now actually get this sort of perspective effect on it. So now it looks like we have a table, and actually I think this means we need to up this a bit more like this, right? And the last thing I'm going to do is I'm just going to bound this to the bottom. So this means it's rotating around the bottom edge instead, right? Right, that looks pretty good. That's definitely a table. I think everyone can see. Now let's go and add a ball. I was just about to type ball in, but ball is not in fact a valid HTML element. Let's add a width of 100. Oh, not percent. 100 pixels. 100 pixels. We're going to add border radius of 99 pixels. Actually, 99 is normally the, I add just enough, so it's more than the size, but if it's 100 pixels, 99 is not actually enough, right? It shouldn't push up the table, so we're going to make it a position absolute. And then we're going to add a background. And here I want a gradient again, but I want actually, I think I want this a little bit lighter. And this one, I still want red, but darker. See? Oh, now we're getting this nice ball shader on it, right? So it looks like, and it kind of works with the same, like it looks like we have a light right on top. And I'm just going to move the default button position here to be 50 pixels. That was 150 pixels. Let's go there, right? Maybe actually a bit less here. And this is just like me setting, where does it sit when it sits flat on the table? Where should it sit? Right here, right? So now we have this ball, and now we can start animating it, right? So in the style panel over here, we have this new animation section. And if I add that, we get our new animation editor. And it is a lot, we know, because it is a very powerful tool that lets you, give you a lot of freedom to customize your animations, right? It's not as complex as it looks. There's a lot of default. animations you can do here. If you just want something simple, you just click fade in. You go, ooh, it fades in. But we don't really want that. We don't need to fade in, right? We want it to bounce. And the bounce one is actually technically what we're looking for, but we don't want this kind of bounce, right? Not that. That's a weird hover bounce. We want it to land all the way from the top. So I'm going to go make my own, right? When the animation editor is open, the whole style panel over here, can you see changes? And you get all these keyframe buttons. And that's because now everything is like styling that animation, right? So I'm going to add a transform. In this case, I'm going to use translate. And I'm going to translate the Y to -50 viewport height. Boop. And this is technically enough, right? You don't need an end frame because it'll just animate, like it'll automatically figure out that it's animating to its default position, right? And you see, after we play this animation, it sort of drops down. You can add more, like if you want to like, let's say we could add a keyframe here where we're saying that'll be 0 and then 0. That's our it landing on the table bit, right? And then we could have it bounce up to 0 -40 viewport height. And then you would have this like doing, right? This effect, right? That also works. But actually for this example, I don't even want to add more keyframes. But you can see, like, you can take this pretty much as far as you want, right? Another nice, I'm going to clear out these keyframes. Another really nice feature of the animation editor is you can scrub. So you can like hold down the timeline and see exactly where the ball is going to be at any bit. So if you need to make adjustments, it's really easy to make these fine adjustments here, right? Excellent. Now, when we look at our animation, I think the biggest problem is the fact that it's slowing down while it's falling, right? That doesn't make any sense. So other than the keyframes, at the bottom here, we have a bunch of different controls, right? So we can say how many iterations do we want? Do we want it to do it, maybe we want to do it twice before it stops? Then it'll do this, right? Or we can say infinite, and it'll just keep going forever, right? In this case, we just want the one, I think. We can say how long should the total duration be? How much time should it lapse, right? And should we add a delay before the animation actually starts? That can be really, really interesting, especially when you're animating multiple elements or have multi-stage animations, right? Direction is, we can play it backwards. Whoop. Or we can play it forward and backwards. Oh, but we need 2 iterations to do that because it means it's going to alternate, right? Whoop. Right, a lot of different controls here about how you do. Fill mode is an interesting one. It basically means when the animation is done, where should it end, right? It doesn't mean too much in our case because it naturally animates towards its default position, right? But you could say fill forward. In this case, that's going to do the same. It's going to say stop, freeze on the last frame, right? You can also say fill backwards. And that means when you're done animating, it's going to jump back to top. In this case, we just go back to one animation, right? So depending on the kind of animation and what you're using it for, this can be really useful, right? And finally, we have the one we're actually looking for, right? Which is the timing function. Now, the timing functions basically said, within these 2 seconds, I need to go from 0 or from -50 viewport height to 0, right? How should I distribute that animation? And we can do the linear. Linear means that it changes evenly throughout the animation, right? You can see it moves at the same pace at all time. Then you have ease. Ease says it's going to start out faster and then drop. For a lot of UI animation, that gives a more tactile feel. So that's really good to use. Ease in and out is another one to play around with. It kind of adds a little bit of slowness both to the start and end. In our case, we want to go a little bit more custom. So if we look at here, we open up the custom panel, we can really control like down to the detail exactly how this animation should play. And we can even like play it right here and see the sort of effect of what does this happen, right? What does this do, right? Now we can start playing that and we can see, okay, so that sort of gave it a very aggressive in and out by changing these, right? You can even like do it above, right? That actually gives this interesting effect of like it goes beyond where it should, right? And we have all sorts of approximation functions here, right? So spring is essentially gives this very bouncy effect, so we can try and change its stiffness here. And let's go and try that. It gives this boing spring effect. None of this looks even remotely like a ball, right? We're just playing around. The one I'm interested in here is the one called bounce. And what bounce does is essentially gives it this ball effect, right? So I'm just going to use the default because it's actually really good. Let's try that. This is kind of perfect for a ball, right? You can go and tweak all these. And these factors are essentially like gravity, drag, bounciness. Differently change how high it's going to bounce, the time between bounces, all these things, right? But at the end of the day, the default works really well for us. So we're just going to keep that, right? So now we have this nice bounce effect, and we can see how that actually works. So we're pretty much there, but I think one little detail that kind of sells this whole animation would be to give it a shadow, right? And like you could do that with drop shadow to some degree, but drop shadow casts a shadow on the background. We want to cast a shadow on the floor or the table in this case. And there isn't any like CSS property that does that, right? CSS is not really meant for that level of 3D graphics. So we'll have to make our own, right? I'm going to add a third div. We're adding a lot of divs now. And potentially we should, we could rename them to something else. Let's call this, let's rename this to bounce ball. All right, and we'll rename this to ball. So renaming elements like this means that you're actually changing the actual HTML element in. So if you do that, and for some reason, if it shouldn't be a semantic element, it doesn't have to be. In this case, ball is not a semantic HTML element. So in this case, just make sure there's a hyphen in it. Then it's still a valid HTML. It'll be interpreted just as a div. So you're perfectly fine to do this. As long as there's no web components on your site with that exact name, it's not going to be a problem, right? And hopefully you are in control of that. So now we have our shadow. We're actually just going to copy everything from, we have a nice little copy all properties from the ball, and we're going to apply that to the shadow, right? So now we have a ball shadow here. It looks exactly like this one. It shouldn't really look exactly like this one, right? Because it's a shadow. But we got most of the right things in there, and that actually just makes it easier for us to get started this way. So the first thing I want to do is I want to change the inset. I'm going to move that down a bit. Oh, it's really hard to see. Let's start by changing this one to be, both of them should be black, right? This one should be more transparent. This one should be slightly less transparent. Right, we actually want the ball to be on top, right? And then we want this one. Oh, actually, no. We want this to be inside the table, right? Because it's going to be mapped. If we want to rotate the same as the table. So let's just drag the ball shadow inside this one, right? And now okay, so now we got the shadow. It's not exactly where we need it. So let's actually just use good old, yeah, here we go. Just center that. That was pretty easy. And then for inset, 0 might be, 0 is not a million miles off, right? But maybe we do change it a bit, right? So right is that. And maybe actually the ball shadow should be like, 80 was 2. What happens if we say this should be a bit smaller? Does that make sense? It's not that much. Yeah, something like that. Because we want to give this effect of a shadow. No, actually, that doesn't make sense. It should be the same size. Because we're saying there's a point light on the top. If anything, maybe even a bit larger, right? If there's a point light on the top, it's not going to make the shadow smaller underneath. That doesn't make any sense. Okay, but this is pretty good. The last thing I want to do is I'm going to add here in advanced. I'm going to say filter. And then I'm just going to say blur, let's say 10 pixels. So that blurs the edge of my shadow. Actually, it blurs the whole shadow, right? And gives me this nice, more shadow-like effect. And now that we do that, we might actually want to bump the opacity up a bit for these two to give it a little bit more, right? Okay, that looks pretty good. So now let's go and look at the animation, because the animation here should not quite be like the ball, but it's not a million miles off. We're still going to do a transform. We're going to start it at, in this case, whenever the shadow, when the ball moves up, we want the shadow to move down, because that's going to give, I think, going to give the right effect. Let's try that. Let's give it 50 pixels. That's definitely not enough. Let's say, actually, it should probably fall outside the screen. So let's do so like 120, 130. That's probably good. Okay. Okay, and it still has the same bounce effect because we actually copied the animation from the ball, right? So we have the same timing function. Let's try and give that a quick, if we refresh, we'll replay the whole animation, right? Together. I mean, that looks pretty good. That's not bad, right? But one more thing we could do with animation is we could transform its scale. So scale changes the size of an element, but only the way it's rendered, not the actual size it takes up. In the case of this is an absolute precision shadow. It doesn't actually matter if we use width or height or scale. But scale tends to be just a little bit more performant because it, like, the browser knows that it can do some optimizations it's not sure it can do with width, right? So let's do 1 point, or let's do 2. Is that aggressive? That is probably a bit aggressive. That's 1.5. Right, let's try that instead. And then we are doing this all the way down to 0. And again, because we have that bounce effect, it's going to follow the right step. It's going to match the ball exactly, right? Okay. Let's go and try that in a new tab. It looks pretty good. Actually, we'll just actually change the background here to match. Yeah. There we are. So there's our ball animation. I hope you thought this was interesting. I hope you want to dive into the animation editor and try it out and play around with it. It is incredibly fun. There are so many cool examples of what people are building with this now. And it's so easy to add that just little bit of extra finesse to your application. That little bit of extra work that takes 5 minutes, but gives so much more for the user experience. So please go and try it out. Please play around with it and make sure you share whatever you're building because we love seeing it. Thank you so much.